FSN Radio. It's all about what's next. Go to financialsurvivalnetwork.com and sign up for your free weekly newsletter. You'll also get 3 free reports. The Financial Survival Network. It's all about what's next.
Welcome. You are listening to the Financial Survival Network. I'm Kerry Lutz. Today is July 23rd, 2019. Hey, all. We had a Bitcoin winner. I'll be sending you all out emails letting you know, but he was $19, just shy of $19 off on the price. So got to give him credit because I was only about almost $4,000 off. So anyway, Mike, you are the winner. We really appreciate your playing, and we'll be having another contest shortly. So email us. Make sure you get on the list, kl@kerrylutz.com. Well, these are tumultuous times. Everything after Trump seems to be in flux. You're never quite sure what he's going to do, when he's going to do it, or why. Well, interesting book out by Kasey Pipes, a former White House speech writer for George W. Bush, called After the Fall, The Remarkable Comeback of Richard Nixon. So, book, wrote that book. Kasey, first, welcome. You wrote that book a while back, and, it seems to be becoming more relevant than ever. You see a lot of parallels between President Trump and President Nixon. And what do you think the most glaring parallel, the most in-your-face parallel is when you think of the two?
Well, it's not the one everybody talks about. I mean, obviously, everyone considers Trump as scandal-plagued president, and they want to compare him to Nixon. That's sort of obvious and an easy comparison to make. I think the more important comparison is on matters of foreign policy, where Richard Nixon was a foreign policy president who pursued the idea of realism, the idea that American policy should protect American interests around the globe. He has been followed, with the notable exception of George H.W. Bush, by a series of presidents who largely pursued idealism in their foreign policy, that they wanted to make the world a better place. They wanted to protect human rights. And Trump, in many ways, is a throwback to Nixon. It's not, it's a clumsier attempt. It's a more visceral attempt, but it's sort of I think he sees it as a foreign policy based on realism, where he is trying to look out for America and American interest, and is not really worried about creating democracies around the world or protecting human rights around the world. It's strictly based on what is best for America. And I think that is similar in many ways to Nixon, although they're very different in the way they go about it. I think Nixon was much more coherent in the way he pursued foreign policy. But even in the Nixon post-presidency, which is what I write about in this book, he spent most of his time thinking and writing about foreign policy and trying to influence presidents and how they enacted foreign policy, and was successful to a remarkable degree as an elder statesman in working in this area. So it is a fascinating topic, and in some ways there are comparisons to today.
Yeah. And so we do see things, but we were talking earlier, well, Nixon was an innovator. He wasn't afraid to approach China, wasn't afraid to approach Russia to pursue what he perceived to be the country's interests. Trump is the same way in that regard, isn't he?
He is. I mean, I think he's trying to be. I don't know. I think the jury's still out on how effective he'll be, but he certainly sees himself as protecting American interest first, last, and always. We saw this just yesterday in the Oval Office when he was asked about policy in Afghanistan, and he complained at length about how we've been there for 18 years and we can't be the policeman of the world, and we can't solve all the world's problems, and we need to bring the troops home. These are shades of realism coming through in his comments, that he sees the world differently than his predecessors did. I mean, Barack Obama waxed poetic about the Arab Spring. George W. Bush famously tried to support the creation of a democracy in the Middle East. I mean, these are idealistic approaches that I think Nixon would have been very uncomfortable with, and Trump certainly is uncomfortable with. I mean, he ran in 2016 complaining about the Bush administration and its policy in the Middle East. So I think he is similar in some ways. And again, I think the question is, we have to wait and see how this plays out to see how effective he is.
Yeah. So interesting. You talk about the so-called idealism. I don't know what the idealism was behind the Vietnam War. It seemed more fear of the domino effect, false flag. I don't know. One certainly could argue that we were conned into joining that war to basically committing lives and treasure to that war. So Trump seems to be looks like use of force war is the last thing that he will go to, rather than seemingly other presidents who really, exercise the military option probably a little too fast without enough thought.
Yeah, I think Nixon, I can't speak to Kennedy and Johnson on Vietnam. I'm not an expert on that, but Nixon saw Vietnam policy precisely in terms of realpolitik, that we were protecting our interest. We were pushing back in terms of the Cold War against a Soviet client, the North Vietnamese. And even his policy of opening the door to China was done in terms of pushing back against the Soviets. I mean, they had a little bit of a rift with their client, the Chinese, and he tried to exploit that. Again, it's classic realism. I do think Trump views military force as a last option. I don't think it's something that he's comfortable with. We saw that recently when, apparently he had been talked into doing some kind of a military strike against Iran and then calls it off, which is, kind of an interesting case study and how Trump leads and makes decisions. I'm not sure what that says about his decision making. It seemed a little indecisive, but he eventually decides, to call it off and not use military force. So I do think that he's uncomfortable with that, and again thinks that America has been overextended in recent years, and that it's time for the troops to come home and kind of protect American interest here. So that is something that is very much in the news, and again is that there is some common ground there.
Hey, well, it's interesting to note, Kasey, that the last president, the last time an airstrike was called off, I think was in Dr. Strangelove, an air attack, an attack on an enemy, or maybe 7 Days in May or Failsafe. That's the only time I ever remember seeing it in the movies. So the fact that somebody could call it off is really, kind of refreshing that, hey, there's room for other means of dealing with the problem. Do you really want to kill a bunch of people over loss of a drone? Is that really worthwhile? And I think that's a really good question. And obviously he answered it in the negative. Supposedly we did a big cyber attack against them. Maybe military force is going to be inevitable there. But if other presidents were more hesitant to use force, things in the country might be a lot different now.
FSN Radio. It's all about what's next.
Today's show is brought to you by U.S. Gold Corp. U.S. Gold Corp is a U.S.-focused gold exploration and development company advancing high-potential projects in Wyoming and Nevada. U.S. Gold Corp has consolidated a district on Nevada's productive Cortex Trend and is advancing the Copper King project towards production in Wyoming. Led by a team of prolific company builders and renowned explorers, including Dave Mathewson, who is directly responsible for several major Nevada gold discoveries. U.S. Gold Corp is well-capitalized and has an extremely tight share structure with less than 20 million shares outstanding and trades on the NASDAQ, a major exchange, under the ticker symbol USAU. To learn more, go to usgoldcorp.gold. That's usgoldcorp.gold.
The Financial Survival Network. It's all about what's next.
Yeah, I think the only question I would have is why did he make an opposite decision in the first place? Is kind of interesting. What was going on in his mind to make him think it was a good idea in the first place? I don't know the answer to that. We'll have to wait until the history books on Trump are written. But I think in general, it's a very good idea for presidents to be cautious about the use of military force. or when they are using it, to use it when it's directly connected to some overarching policy goal.
Right.
And I think, again, Nixon is a pretty good example of that in terms of what he was trying to do on the world stage, in terms of how he tried to fight and end the Vietnam War. He was not somebody who was eager or trigger happy, but he was not afraid to use it if it was connected with protecting American national interest.
Yeah. And, we don't really know if Trump ever intended to send the missiles over there. Maybe by telling him he was, and then saying, "Oh, changed my mind," that could do more to shake up the Iranians than actually just launching the attack, however abbreviated it was going to be. It was not going to be a major attack. It was just going to be a tit for tat, don't mess with us kind of attack. But here they are, they're waiting for the attack, and then all of a sudden it's like called off. And, that's got to really be kind of unsettling. You've dug in your defenses, you're ready to start shooting, and then all of a sudden you find out, no, not going to happen. Have a cyber attack instead. It could be a strategic aim or policy that he did. Now, everybody seems to think that Trump never plans anything out, shoots from the hip. How did he get elected? All those things. But for a guy who doesn't know what he's doing, he's made some pretty bright, bold moves, hasn't he?
Well, he certainly is very instinctual and he campaigned by instinct. He governs by instinct. His instincts in many cases have surprised people, as you mentioned in the 2016 case. He may have been the only one that saw that victory coming. And that's no small thing in politics. Nixon appreciated political figures that had great instincts. It's one of the things he liked about Ronald Reagan, and I talk about that in the book at length, his relationship with Reagan. And they had a complicated relationship, but he said to his son-in-law at one point, "I have a great mind, Reagan has a great gut." And what he meant by that was he had a great instinct for where the country was, how people were thinking about things, how people were feeling about things, and Reagan could tap into that. And Nixon wanted to, as a outside advisor, help Reagan take advantage of that. And one of the ideas he came up with, which he suggested to Mike Deaver in 1982, was the Saturday morning radio address, which Nixon, it was his idea, and he suggested it to Deaver and Reagan. They loved the idea. They put it into place, and it was a way to take advantage of Reagan's communication skills and his ability to connect with the country. So having a great instinct for politics is not something to be laughed at. It's a very valuable trait, and it's something that Nixon admired in others that he saw it in, that he watched in politics.
Yeah. Nixon definitely was a master strategist. I know for a fact he was an excellent lawyer, knew his firm in New York City, had a lot of interesting qualities. Nixon also had some fatal flaws, which did him in the end. But like you write in your book, he came back from that, and kind of like, look, all former presidents seem to be cut a break. Even Jimmy Carter, whose his administration was arguably the biggest failure of any presidency up to date that anybody remembered, put it that way. The fact is that he was really a failed president, and now he's been elevated to a level that he probably doesn't deserve, but it just shows that if you can outlive your opponents, you will be rescued by history.
Yeah, I think it's interesting you bring up Carter. I write in the book quite a bit about Carter and what Nixon thought. He was not a fan. He thought that Carter was extremely weak and ineffective. He thought he was overly idealistic on foreign policy. He was outraged at how the Carter administration dealt with the Shah. And of course, then he was outraged at the Iranian hostage crisis. Mm-hmm. And it sort of, he saw this as sort of opening the door for Reagan, and was encouraging Reagan during this time to run again, gave advice and counsel to Reagan throughout the 1980 campaign, and really saw Reagan as having a chance to sort of right the ship of state in terms of foreign affairs, and wanted to be a part of that, wanted to be helping Reagan right the wrongs of the previous administration and really sort of prosecute the Cold War in a very assertive way. It's interesting, Nixon in the 1980s is really moving to the right. I mean, he's always been a realist on foreign policy, but he writes a book called The Real War. He encourages a very strong posture with the Soviets. Reagan reads the book, is a fan of the book. He and Nixon talk about the Soviets a lot. And then with the Gorbachev era, Nixon is encouraging Reagan to be aggressive, to get concessions, to not just take any deal, to not just do any summit for the sake of doing a summit. And for the most part, he's successful in this. He's working very closely with the Reagan administration and with Bud McFarlane, who was his friend, who was the national security advisor.
Right.
But he actually, ironically, is sort of outraged when Reagan signs the 1987 INF treaty because he thinks Reagan gave up too much. So it's kind of interesting. We think of Reagan as being the conservative and Nixon being the moderate. Reagan is the one who signs a treaty essentially eliminating an entire class of nuclear weapons. And Nixon thinks it's too much. He thinks he gave away the store. So it's fascinating to watch their relationship and the ebbs and flows of it. But again, it shows and makes the point of the book, which is that Nixon was way more involved and way more successful in his post-presidency than we've previously realized.
Yeah. There's a lot to Nixon, a very complex character for sure, as is Trump. In the end, how successful was Nixon? If you had to rate the success of his foreign policy, putting aside Watergate, which, was more a political situation, looking back on things, what's happened recently than anything else?
Well, I think there's a couple of ways to answer that question. I mean, one is, you've already hinted at it, you almost have to take Watergate and set it aside. Nixon himself said this. I mean, he talked, when he was asked about his legacy, he would say, well, it depends on if you're only looking at Watergate or if you actually look at the whole record. I think if you look at the whole record, the American people in 1972, they sort of passed their judgment on it, and it was a 49-state landslide. I mean, Nixon was extremely popular and viewed at the time as being extremely successful. The other way to look at it is that because his post-presidency helped rehabilitate himself, and because he became a player as an elder statesman, as an advisor to three presidents, including a Democrat, Bill Clinton, I think that people view him differently now and in a more favorable light. And a great example of that is the eulogy Bill Clinton gave at Nixon's funeral, where Clinton says in the speech that the time of judging Nixon only on Watergate has to come to an end. We have to judge the entire record and all of his achievements as well. Clinton, it's interesting, began his career running in the era of Watergate in Arkansas, running against Nixon, running against the Republican Party. Hillary was, of course, a lawyer on the Watergate committee investigating Nixon. And yet 19 years later, in 1993, Clinton is calling on Nixon as president to get advice and counsel on Russia and Boris Yeltsin. And they became very close during this time. They talked numerous times, and Nixon was sort of impressed with Clinton's intellectual ability. He certainly wasn't a fan of his politically. And they became somewhat close. And as I say, at the funeral, Clinton gave a magisterial tribute to Nixon. And I think that sort of helped seal his fate that the comeback had been successful, and Nixon had been rehabilitated to a certain extent. It's up to people to decide, what they think of Nixon, both in terms of his presidency and his post-presidency. But he certainly achieved quite a bit as president, and I would argue with this book, it documents how much he achieved as an ex-president as well.
Absolutely. Well, no review of Nixon would be complete without the review of his economic policies, which I know you're mainly geared for foreign policy, but the economic policy really did have a profound effect on the world. And as libertarians go back, we look at 1971, Nixon closing the gold window.
Right.
putting the U.S. on a strict fiat currency
Right.
system, and that leading to massive inflation over the next, well, we're going to be at 50 years shortly, major inflation, major government debt. We had debt before, but not the likes of what we have now, and a leveraging up of the global financial system, the petrodollar, the whole thing. That was all Nixon and Kissinger's brainchild. Wouldn't he have just been better off devaluing the dollar and calling it a day?
You know, it's interesting. I sort of grew up having my doubts about Nixon economic policy. I still do. I'm not an economist by any means. It's interesting. I'm trying to think of the last major Republican figure to actually make a major issue out of the gold standard, and I think it's Jack Kemp was probably the last one.
Reagan was trying to do it, and then 70 days after he started his term, he was shot, and that was the last time we ever heard of Reagan trying.
And so it kind of has been accepted even by the right to some extent. It's interesting. You mentioned the deficits and the annual deficits, and then the cumulative national debt. Again, Reagan sort of almost puts a seal of approval on this in the 80s. I mean, Reagan was willing to live with deficits in many ways. And of course, we know that the Reagan deficits were significant because he was cutting taxes and growing the economy and spending massively on a military buildup. I think most people look back on that. Most Reagan historians look back on that and think that was probably the right call. I mean, the economy was booming, and the military buildup helped lead to the end of the Cold War. So some of the things Nixon did, I mean, he certainly wasn't an ideological conservative on domestic policy. That's well documented. Again, there's shades of that today with Trump, who's not an ideological conservative on domestic policy either, with tariffs and his hands-off approach on entitlement reform. But nevertheless, some of those Nixon decisions have remained in place and been codified, and the country's done okay. So I'll leave it to economists to debate the real Nixon record on that. But it is interesting that some of those are with us today, and I suppose are a part of his legacy in a sense.
Yeah, and we were talking earlier before the call. I don't think Trump would have signed a bill enabling or creating the Environmental Protection Agency, which arguably has a mission over creep. It's done a lot of things to negatively affect growth in the country. As a conservative, how do you reconcile Nixon's record wage and price controls, which are definitely a no-no? We got growing government, adding more agencies, all of these things. Nixon really kind of went against his roots, as did Reagan and others, of course.
Right. So the traditional answer you always hear from Nixon people is, particularly on wage and price control, that what Congress was brewing up was going to be a lot worse than what he did. It's a similar argument that you hear historians make about FDR and the New Deal, that, the New Deal may have represented bigger government, but it was a lot better than what Huey Long had in mind, which would have been almost socialism. Again, I'm not an expert on economic policy. I'll let others pass judgment on that. But it is true that he faced majorities of Democrats in both houses. It was a very difficult political situation, and he wanted to focus most of his time, energy, and effort on foreign policy, where he believed in that era, 1969 to 1974, there was a lot at stake in the world, both in terms of the Vietnam War, making sure that came to some sort of a moderately successful conclusion, the opening to China, détente with the Russians. These were the things that animated him and drove policy during this time. And he was not an ideological conservative on domestic policy by any means. And so I think that's, those are things we'll be debating, I suspect, for decades to come.
Yes, no doubt. No doubt. So I guess, It's kind of like they say in divorces, there's three sides to every story, his, hers, and the truth. In this case, there's who he wanted to be, what he wanted to do, and what he was actually able to do. And reality is always a limiting factor on every president's goals, no matter how worthy, lofty, or absurd they might be. Even Obama, who wanted to fundamentally transform the United States, wasn't able to quite pull it off, as we're seeing his legacy now unraveled and reversed by Trump wherever possible. And maybe that will be Trump's greatest legacy, the unraveling of the Obama legacy. Hey, we don't know yet. The jury's still out on North Korea, jury's out on Venezuela, on the Middle East, all of these hot spots. But so far, he hasn't gotten us into a war, and the economy has not collapsed. The biggest warnings of the Democrats and his opponents in the media were that the economy would crash if Trump was elected, and we'd be at war with Russia. And in fact, it hasn't happened yet.
No, it's true. And again, I think Trump does benefit in some ways from people sort of not, particularly critics in the media, sort of not taking him seriously, not giving him credit for things. I mean, Nixon, again, there's some similarities there. I mean, Nixon, particularly during the Reagan era, when he was on the sidelines but giving advice and counsel, saw the media coverage of Reagan as something of a blessing in disguise. That ordinary people could see through it. They saw that the elites didn't like Reagan necessarily and didn't like some of the things he was doing, and so Nixon saw that as sort of a badge of courage that Reagan should wear. And even the 1984 campaign, after the first debate, when the media immediately announced that Mondale had won this tremendous victory in the first debate, Nixon writes a memo to Reagan and says, "Of course, the media is going to say that you lost. They don't like you. They want Mondale to win." But he said in the same memo, "But this is good for you because now they've raised the bar on Mondale, and you're going to show up in the second debate, and because the bar has been raised so high on Mondale, he can't possibly win." And of course, this is exactly what happened. We remember the famous 1984 debate, the second debate, when Reagan takes on the issue of his age and laughs about how we shouldn't turn to somebody who's youthful and has inexperience, referring to Mondale, and just sort of made a joke of his poor performance in the first debate. But Nixon was right that the media coverage, the media overplayed their hand. And he saw that as a gift to Reagan, and he was right. And I suppose that in some ways, Trump sees himself in the same way, that the media is a gift in a sense, that they're against him, and he believes that his voters can see through that.
Yeah, and it worked the first time. We'll see if it works the second.
That's right.
Anyway, Kasey, just tell us your website, best place to find you.
So it's Kasey with a K, Kaseys, pipes.com. You can read all about the book there. You can order it on Amazon.com, or it's in Barnes & Noble's stores around the country. And I hope people will check it out and take a look, see what they think.
Yeah, and if you're going to go get it at Barnes & Noble, you better do it quickly. I think they just filed for bankruptcy. And bookstores, I always joke, Kasey, when I have people on the show who've written a book, say wherever fine books used to be sold.
That's right.
Because they're just not sold there anymore. Well, we wish you the best of luck on the book. And,
thank you so much.
Hey, I'd love to see your next book, actually a contrast between Nixon and Trump. You might have to wait a little while. You might only have to wait a year and a half, or you might have to wait 6 years. But
who knows? We'll see.
I think it would be great. Hey, wish you the best of luck. Thanks so much for stopping by.
Thanks so much. I appreciate it.
FSN Radio. It's all about what's next. Go to financialsurvivalnetwork.com and sign up for your free weekly newsletter. You'll also get 3 free reports. The Financial Survival Network. It's all about what's next.